Barakatah Yahweh, Barakatah Yahweh Shai, Bahasham, Barakahak Wadash, Barakatum. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, glory, and infinite honors to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahweh Shai. Double honors to the apostles and elders, a great millstone who ruled and teach well. In peace and salutations to you sincere Akim out there, pushing this word in truth and sincerity to the four corners of the globe. May you brothers endure until the end. This is the brother Ra'aya coming at you with another lesson, and I'm going to start it off with this article from Reuters.com titled, Trump Threatens NATO Exit, Scaling Up Tensions with Allies. And hey, biblical prophecy just continues to speed ahead at a breakneck pace. We truly are, living in the last seconds of this devil, Esau Edom, the so-called white man's rulership, because it's a major part of prophecy that the U.S. and her NATO allies, would fracture from each other, and America's European allies would ultimately turn against her during World War III and, shoot nuclear missiles onto her. And with Nero 47, DJ Donald Trump, he looks to be the perfect man for the job to fracture the relationship between the U.S. and her, Western European allies. Because even during his first administration, what did he do? Tell the European nations that they had to shore up their funding of NATO. And then during the lead up to his second selection, he was saying, hey, if you don't want to pay the money, Russia, come in and do what you want to do. He's threatening like Greenland, Alberta, Canada, which, Canada's a NATO member. And now over this Strait of Hormuz situation, he's threatening to just outright leave NATO. Tensions between the United States and NATO allies flared up as President Donald Trump said he was considering pulling the U.S. out of the Western alliance due to its European members' refusing to send ships to unblock the Strait of Hormuz. NATO, which includes European countries, the United States and Canada, was formed in 1949 with the aim of countering the risk of Soviet attack and has been the cornerstone of the West's security ever since. Trump told Reuters on Wednesday that he would state in an address to the nation later in the day that he was absolutely, as a brother down here, Kaya says, considering withdrawing the U.S. from the NATO alliance. I'll be discussing my disgust with NATO, he said of the speech. Asked if he was thinking about pulling out of NATO, he said, oh, absolutely, without question. Wouldn't you do that if you were me? This is Daniel chapter 7. I'm going to start at verse 19. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which that fourth beast in the vision that, or in the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar of the Neo-Babylonian Empire had, that the prophet Daniel interpreted for him. Those legs of iron were speaking of the ancient pagan Edomite Roman Empire. Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast, which was diverse from all the others, exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron and his nails of brass, which devoured, break in pieces, and stamped the residue with his feet. Because, when Rome was in its height, back then, it was a powerhouse in the known world, in the Mediterranean, just as, the U.S. and these Western nations are today, which they're the reincarnation of the Roman Empire, going into those iron toes mixed with miry clay. And of the 10 horns that were in his head, and of the other which came up, and before whom 3 fell, and that other horn which came up, that little horn is speaking of the United States of America, and those 3 that fell are speaking of the British, the French, and the Spanish, who were the major players in the so-called New World before the 13 colonies became the United States of America, as you know today. Even of that horn that had eyes and a mouth that spake very great things. And just look at how Donald Trump's been moving. He's been speaking very great things, talking about his divine protection in a sense. You had that one lady, Paula, was it Paula White? I'm not too sure, but his spiritual advisor, that female Christian preacher, which that's all off, was comparing him to Jesus, just complete madness. And as we're reading in that article, he's talking about his disgust with NATO, and he outright told Spain, look, you don't want us to use your airports for our military aircraft. I can do it anyway. I can do what I want. Whose look was more stout than his fellows. And when we go to that word stout, it's H7229, Ra'ab, which in the outline of biblical usage says great, figurative of power, captain, chief, lord, master, which is exactly how, the United States of America, especially under Donald Trump, has been moving towards her NATO allies with that proud, stout look. Hey, if you don't want to pay your bills, Russia come invade to Spain. We can use your airports for our aircraft. I can do whatever I want. And now talking about leaving NATO because he's disgusted that America's European allies don't want to get into this quagmire that is this Iran war, which is ultimately leading towards the battle in the Valley of Jehoshaphat, the War of Armageddon. Trump's remarks reflect his ongoing frustration with NATO and came just hours after his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, declined to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to NATO's collective defense, a concept that lies at the heart of the alliance. Experts say it is not clear whether Trump could act unilaterally to leave the 77-year-old coalition, even though he frequently makes major decisions without congressional approval, some of which are held up by U.S. courts. And, for whatever reason, these courts and other politicians have been kowtowing to Donald Trump, and he's just been moving like a true king, like an emperor out here, doing whatever he wants. And whether he can legally, leave NATO or not, or whether he outright, does it or not, this is just one more nail in the coffin of the NATO alliance and America and Europe's, alliance in general, which this brings me to my next article, because as it said, it is not clear whether Trump could act unilaterally to leave the coalition. This is an article from yahoo.com. As Trump threatens NATO exit, Schumer reminds Marco Rubio of his own law blocking any quick withdrawal, couldn't act on a whim. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has firmly stated that the Senate will not vote to leave NATO, despite President Donald Trump's recent contemplation of withdrawal. Schumer took to X on Wednesday and highlighted that State Secretary Marco Rubio sponsored a bill in 2023 that requires a 2/3 vote of the Senate for the U.S. to withdraw from NATO. Thank you, too, at Secretary Rubio for sponsoring the bill in 2023 requiring 2/3 vote of the Senate to make sure clueless presidents couldn't act on a whim, wrote Schumer. This move was made to ensure that the decision to leave the alliance would not be made impulsively by any president. But it is saying that previous article, Trump has been moving unilaterally without the approval of Congress, and he's even had some U.S. courts agree with him. The Democratic leader also highlighted a 2023 post by Rubio, then a senator, in which he celebrated the bill's passage. I can promise this: the Senate will not vote to leave NATO or abandon our allies just because Trump is upset they wouldn't go along with his reckless war of choice. And, Lil Marco, he's straight kissing Trump's ass at this point. I saw an article where Trump bought, I think, everybody in his cabinet a pair of shoes, and he didn't even ask anybody what size they wore. So Marco Rubio's been walking around with shoes, 2 sizes too big for his feet, looking like the clown that he is, which, it's perfect because the whole Trump administration is a circus. NATO tensions rise, exit unlikely. Schumer's post was in response to Trump's statements about potentially withdrawing from NATO, revealed in an interview with The Telegraph. The president has been vocal about his dissatisfaction with the alliance, particularly their refusal to support the U.S. in its ongoing conflict with Iran. However, markets and prediction odds suggest that a full U.S. withdrawal by 2027 is still a low probability risk. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is set to visit Washington next week for a previously scheduled trip confirmed by the alliance and White House officials. In December, analysts at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace said that the president's push for higher European defense spending is accelerating a shift towards regional production and greater procurement independence, particularly in northeastern Europe's expanding defense industrial hub, potentially impacting major U.S. military contractors. So with just this constant going back and forth between the U.S. and her Western European allies, you're seeing these European nations start to look for greener pastures. They don't know whether they're going to have the U.S. fully to come to their defense or not in the event of a major war with Russia or China. I'm going to go back to this first article. There's something I wanted to discussed with NATO. Experts have warned that Trump's repeated remarks suggesting that the United States might not honor its NATO commitment could encourage Russia to test NATO members' readiness to enforce the alliance's Article 5, which states an armed attack against one member state is an attack on all. France was among the first European NATO members to react to similar comments by Trump to Britain's Daily Telegraph, published earlier in the day, in which Trump called NATO a paper tiger and said he was considering exiting the alliance after allies failed to back U.S. military action against Iran. Let me recall what NATO is, French Junior Army Minister Alice Ruffo said, though without directly addressing Trump's threat to leave NATO. It's a military alliance concerned with the security of territories in the Euro-Atlantic area. It is not intended to carry out an operation in the Strait of Hormuz, which is not in accordance with international law. French President Alexander Stubb told Trump in a phone call that a more European NATO was taking shape and that Europe was shouldering more responsibility, his office said. But Julian Smith, who was former President Joe Biden's ambassador to NATO, said Europe was already spending huge sums of money on its own defense, but it would probably be the better part of a decade before they can really take on all the roles and responsibilities that the U.S. is currently providing to the alliance. Well, hey, if they make a full shift over to Russia and China, they won't have to wait so long. Trying to hit the main points. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer said he would act in his country's interest, whatever the noise. The instability caused by the Iran war meant Britain should pivot to focus on closer economic and defense ties with Europe, he said. Hey, Jeremiah 50, your mother which bare you shall be sore confounded, because America came out of Britain. So this whore's own mother is eventually going to, kick her out of the house, so to speak. The Iran war has exacerbated tensions between the U.S. and Europe that have been mounting since the start of Trump's second term in office over everything from trade to Ukraine and his demands for ownership of Greenland, an autonomous territory of NATO ally Denmark. Asked Tuesday if the United States was still committed to NATO's collective defense, Hegseth said, As far as NATO is concerned, that's a decision that will be left to the president, but I'll just say a lot has been laid bare. You don't have much of an alliance if you have countries that are not willing to stand with you when you need them, Hegseth said. France has refused to allow Israel to use its airspace to resupply a flight carrying American weapons being used in the war against Iran, and Italy denied permission for U.S. military aircraft to land at the Sigonella Air Base in Sicily before heading to the Middle East, sources told Reuters. Both France and Italy said it was standard policy and nothing had changed. Spain, however, said publicly it had fully closed its airspace to U.S. planes involved in attacks on Iran. Trump has also repeatedly blasted Britain for not joining the United States when it launched the war. As Yahushua said in Mark chapter 3, verses 24 to 25, and if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house or a race of people be divided against themselves, that house cannot stand. We can clearly see the house of Esau is divided between these Americans hating each other, the average American citizen against those 1948er Edomites in the Holy Land. And as we've been reading these articles, these European Edomites against these American Edomites. And also, if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. This kingdom of the last leg of the fourth beast, this NATO EU system that the U.S. is a part of and at the head of, is clearly fracturing. And we can see it spilling over into the mainstream with Trump making threats to leave NATO and, NATO and European allies refusing the U.S. to use, military assets to help them in their war against Iran. And this brings us to Daniel chapter 2. I'm going to start at verse 40, going into that dream Nebuchadnezzar had. And the header reads, Rome, and the fourth kingdom shall be strong as iron, those legs of iron. For as much as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things, and as iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes, part of potter's clay and part of iron, that last leg of the fourth beast, this reincarnated Roman Empire, this NATO EU system, and the part of iron can represent NATO, the military aspect, and the part of clay, the European Union, the economic aspect. And also, the iron can represent your stronger nations, like the U.S., Britain, France, Germany, while the clay, your weaker nations, usually referred to as the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. Part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, which we can clearly see, again, from those articles we've been going into. And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. But there shall be in it of the strength of iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken. But now we're coming into the point to where this kingdom is going to be completely broken, and America's own European allies are going to betray her and shoot missiles onto her. This is the book of Obadiah. I'm going to start at verse 1 and then jump down to verse 7. And this whole book is dedicated to the judgment and the downfall of you Edomites. As the header reads, Edom will be humbled. The vision of Obadiah. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh concerning Edom. We have heard a rumor from Yahweh, and an ambassador is sent among the heathen. The prophets preaching this word, telling the average person the biblical times, the prophetic times they're living in. And it's chiefly been done by the men of GMS or Great Millstone. Arise ye, and let us rise up against her in battle, which we're seeing these nations do. Economically right now with the BRICS, and eventually it's going to be militarily. And eventually it's going to include America's allies. Verse 7, all the men of thy confederacy or your allies have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee received all this defense, money and weapons in Europe, from the U.S., have deceived thee and prevailed against thee, completely betraying you. They that eat thy bread, again, receiving all the money, the economic aid and military assistance have laid a wound under thee. They're going to turn those very same weapons against you and mortally wound you. There is none understanding in him. This is Revelation chapter 17, verse 16. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, the 10 horns representing the EU, the European Union, beginning with the first 10 common markets of it, back when it was known as the European Economic Community, and the beast is NATO. These shall hate the whore, mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, as it says in the first couple of verses of this chapter, the United States of America, that rides upon the beast, which pretty much means, it controls this system, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire, laying that wound under thee and shooting nuclear missiles onto you, along with Russia and China and your other enemies, turning America into the biblical lake of fire, and then that desolate, uninhabitable wasteland, which you can read about in Isaiah chapter 13 and Jeremiah chapter 50, Isaiah 34 as well. That's going to stand as an eternal memorial as to what a wicked kingdom looked like, how not to govern the earth, and what the judgment and punishment was for afflicting the apple of the Most High's eye, the true children of Israel, who are known as the so-called Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans today. But that's it with this video. With this video, I hope you sincere Akim and Akwath were edified. Just keep strong. We are almost out of this final wicked captivity of the heathen nations, chiefly of the Edomites. And as always, I'm going to say Abad Babal, Kwam Yasharallah, and until next time, Shalom.